everyone. So, hello everybody and welcome to the latest Lunchtime Bites webinar from the ICBE Advanced Productivity SkillNet. Today our presenters are Dr. Deasún and Zorana Boltić of Scatterwork and Ink Professional, covering the topic area of get insights and motivational tips for implementing dispersed projects. Dr. Deasún is a chartered engineer and principal of Scatterwork, a Swiss-based project consultancy. In addition to decades of project consulting and academic leadership roles, he leads the university on-site audits and project management globally for PMI. Dr. Zorana Boltić is a project management professional and has a PhD in technical science. She has more than 20 years experience in the pharmaceutical industry, ranging from R&D and quality to operations and corporate affairs, and is the principal of AIM Professional in Serbia. Over the course of 20 minutes, both our speakers will draw upon their unique experience in over 40 countries to share insights and motivational tips, which you can apply to reduce project risks. The ground rules for today, our speakers will present for approximately 15 to 20 minutes, followed by 5 to 10 minute question and answers. Everyone is muted, but I've asked you just to check that you're, to mute yourself just to know if you're not. But we really do encourage people to submit questions as the webinar is going on via the chat function. And without further ado, I'll pass you over to Deasún.
Oh, thanks very much for the introduction. Our photographs are there on the page, and if you want to read that, you can read it afterwards when you check up. Just to say that the company empowers project managers to reduce delivery times and costs and so on. It's very traditional. But particularly in business-to-business environments or between divisions, people don't like to be super agile. They want to know when they're going to get something. And our stock in trade, our strength is experience in a very large number of countries. And over the years, we've had many, many clients, and you can look them up. So this is the agenda for today. We're going to pick out one particular thing that helps project managers operate regardless of the methodology. And then when we've picked it out, we're going to, it's actually stakeholders. And then we're going to look at stakeholder diversity in dispersed projects. So we're all in dispersed projects. We all have people in the project somewhere who sit somewhere else. And then we're going to go through a number of specific tips based on our experience. And then at the end, there's an opportunity to comment and ask questions and so on. And hopefully we'll do that within the 20 minutes.
Yeah, well, the first thing that I would like to emphasize is the importance and the relevance of the topics of today for you as project managers, regardless of the methodology that you are using. So, Deasún, if you would please go to the next slide. There is a list of different methodology people are using all over the globe, but the thing is that what we are going to discuss today is really relevant whether you are using agile or waterfall or some other methodologies. So if there is anything that is not in the list, please type in the chat and we might discuss later on during the Q&A session. So basically, I would like also to emphasize the usefulness of the so-called PMBOK guide, which a lot of people refer as the PMI Bible. But on the other hand, I would like to ask you to think about it in a different way, to think about this as a broader set or some of the experience of the world experience of many project managers, thousands of project managers from all across the globe that apply all imaginable methodologies. So whatever methodology that you are using, this PMBOK guide can be a useful reference and a source of knowledge for you to look at and use maybe as a checklist for things that you need to take care and consider when working on your projects. So on the next slide, it is a bit about how the PMBOK guide is organized. It is organized in 5 process groups, and basically the first process group is initiating the project. And in the initiating project group there are only two processes. And what we want to focus on today is the process of identifying the stakeholders, because identifying the stakeholders is basically the first step that we need to take when initiating a project. And the topics of today are basically related to this. So when we talk about the stakeholders, it is important to understand basically some definitions and why stakeholders are so important for our project. So basically, stakeholders, when we are managing a project, we all want to be successful, and the stakeholders are basically the ones who actually decide what means the success for our project. So by definition, all the communication also goes through the stakeholders, and that's why this part is so critical. So basically, it's not only about identifying the stakeholders and who they are on our project, it's the thing that we actually need them to be successful on our project. So stakeholders are the one who decide, as I already said, what means the success on our project, but they are also the ones from whom we need to retrieve all the requirements for our projects and develop the scope. And as you might know from your own experience, some stakeholders might also represent the risk for our projects themselves. So basically, stakeholders are also important for discovering all the risks, which is, I think, key and not optional when managing a project. So here, beside the list of all the common stakeholders that appear on all the projects, the participants, the sponsor, people who actually deliver the results for our project, I would like also to invite you to think broader than that and understand that no project actually happens in a vacuum, but you need to think about all the others who can impact the success of our project, and maybe think about other project managers in your organizations using the same resources, or representing some dependencies for something that you might want to do on your project. So basically, stakeholder is everybody who can affect the success of your project, and everybody who gets affected by what you want to achieve with whatever you are doing on your project. So the next thing is that Deasún will put some more emphasis on the meaning of stakeholders in the Dispersed Project, which is actually the topic for today, and which we are going to discuss in more details.
So I want to focus on distant participants, and distance can be geographical. You could have somebody who's in New Zealand and you're in Ireland, for example, or it could be cultural. Maybe people in Spain, I had them one time working with another group from Poland, and they were culturally quite different. And it could be organizational. They might be in a different division of the same company, so you're not really allowed to talk to them with the same facility that you could with others, for example. And the thing is that the more distant people are, the less they're going to actually do what you want them to do, because they have a boss who sits near them and comes in, stands over them and says, look, today I really, really need you to do da, da, da. And because they're standing there, they drop your project and they'll do the thing for the other person. And the problem with that is your project is then late. And one of the things that we want to talk about is that that distant manager is a stakeholder, and they have to be fully on board, and they have to be fully brought in by, for example, regional management or something like that. So they understand they're not allowed to do that. And that's part of the deal, if you like. But you don't want people to divert, because what makes projects late is just people don't do what they were supposed to do. And then it's a holiday, and then next week they didn't see your mail, and so on, and time goes off. And also, if you get into misunderstandings, the further people are away from you, the harder it is to resolve them for cultural reasons. For example, I've worked quite a lot with China, and I find that for me, they prefer to work with chat, written chat. And they have good written English, but when you talk on the telephone, you find it difficult to understand each other in both directions, I must say. But personally, I don't like chat. So it's quite difficult to get solutions in situations like this. So this summarizes that. It says you get people in distant lands, shall we say somebody one is in Ireland and the other's in Vietnam or something like that. They are culturally and geographically distant. And then you have people that are maybe geographically distant, but in good communication. And an obvious example would be Irish people would usually find United States is not so difficult to deal with, except for the time zones. And then you have people who are quite close. And we're looking at the people who are further away. And we have here a checklist that you could think about. And the point about it's certainly not a complete checklist. You might even have additions to it. But what it does is it says, here are some things that you might think about a difference. I pick out two, for example. One of them is keyboards. And I was working in China, and in China, the keyboard has Latin letters on the front of the key. So if you have to type something, you can. But in Japan, they don't. So you sit in front of a computer, and unless you can remember where all the keys are, you can't even type an email. So that would be one. And another one that struck me was in Morocco, where they have summertime like we do. And then in the middle of that, they had Ramadan. And Ramadan, everyone is fasting and they're hungry. So what they do is they stop summertime during Ramadan, which lasts for a few weeks. And when it's finished, they go back to summertime. Now, if you're in another country, that affects setting up, for example, a telephone conference, which is how I discovered this issue. So what I'm saying is that there could be lots and lots of little details like that that could have big impacts. Zorana. Or do you want me?
Yeah, well, this is where we would like you to pay attention to the Hofstede 6 dimensions of national culture. And what we want to focus on is, we are not going to go through this in details, because you can certainly use the link below and learn more about Hofstede, but the power distance index is something that is quite important. And on the next slide, you can have a comparison between some different countries in terms of power distance index. But what I wanted to emphasize here is, based on Deasún was talking about, is a cultural aspect, and the emphasis is when it comes to working with different cultures, it might be quite important to think about how you can develop your personal cultural competence, meaning that you need to know about yourself and the others, understand how far you want to go with adapting to other cultures, and understand different cultures. I had experience, I had the opportunity to work with German people a lot, and you might know that they sometimes seems quite strict, and whereas they're quite emotional people. They even have a word in German depicting the deepest emotion, which actually doesn't exist in other languages. But on the other hand, when it comes to business, they tend to seem quite directive, which is a completely different motivation for them. So this is something that we need to think about in terms of trying to understand other people's motivations when it comes to culture. And another tip is that you need to think about how to use your sense of humor, because it's a powerful tool to relax situations when it comes to tension or potential conflict. And then again, think about different cultures in terms of humor. And I also had the opportunity to work a lot with Irish, and I'm Serbian. And the thing is that both nations understand sarcasm really well, which is not true for some other nations. So there's something to think about as well.
So I'll just add one comment there, an example of this power distance, and it was cultural. My home base, if you like, is in Switzerland. And I was in Bern, which is the capital, in the middle of the day, standing at a tram stop. And next to me was the president of Switzerland going home for lunch. Now, you just would not meet the president of France or the Queen of England or, you know, president of America just happening to stand next to you waiting for the bus. Just doesn't happen. So, and by the way, Ireland is at the same level for that. I've got lots of examples, but we don't have time for them here. So what you can do is that's on screen. You can follow that link and you could actually try it for the countries that are involved in your project, and you might find something interesting there. So I'm going to move on now, and we're going to talk about specific experiences that we've had. This one here, what happened to us, that there was a product being manufactured in Canada. It was sent to France, and in France they were rejecting it and nobody knew why. And it was blocking a very valuable order. And what actually came out of it when they eventually solved it was that on the release paper in France, there was some confidential information they didn't want to share. So because of that, they didn't release the report. So the product itself met the test, which everyone knew. But they didn't let the paper out. So once they discovered that, they could do something about it. And of course, the problem was that the actual problem wasn't communicated to the stakeholder, who was the supplier, who wanted to get his order through.
Yeah, well, to add to that, I think what actually went wrong in this project is neglecting the risk management process and communicating basically the impacts of the analyzed risks, because this is something that should have been discovered way before it became an issue, actually, and all the cost impacts analyzed and communicated to relevant stakeholders. So maybe that will be the idea on how to overcome or problems like this. Maybe you would like to add something to that?
Yeah, just a quick comment. In my experience, if you tell people it's going to cost us something, they just say yes. But if you give them a number, you know, we've looked at this and it's actually going to cost us 20,000 a week, then they're far more likely to do it. So you have to get the information somewhere, if you can, in numbers or weeks delay, or how many customers we're going to lose if we don't do this, that, and the other thing. So that's part of that tip there. So the next one that we're going to look at was to do with the mobile telephone rollout. And we had to put up networks everywhere, antennas everywhere. And the legal situation at the time did not require the different operators to share mast. So the best mast had already been, the best location had already been taken by the first company. And as it was in Switzerland, we got objection from every single village. As recently as last night, I was in a village where there was no telephone connection. And I would be interesting to know what happened 10 years ago. But if the people spoke German, they had a big objection to an antenna because they would get killed by electro smog. And if they were French speaking, they had a big objection if it didn't look good. So you could put an antenna inside a church tower, for example, as long as nobody could see it. But you got an objection from everywhere. And that actually blocked the rollout of the entire network, and it upset the entire profit planning. And the boss got, the rollout manager got fired on a Friday night. She was my boss. So, here's some things that went wrong. One of them was that there was an inhabitant, there was a lady living in a high-rise block, and she complained that the antenna that we put up gave her headaches. So we sent out an engineer, and we discovered there wasn't even a cable connected to the antenna, but she still got headaches. And then she went on television and complained about it and generated huge political pressure. So the point is, she was a stakeholder. That's the whole point there. And this had not been identified.
So yeah, this is a very good example of not identifying all the stakeholders and not thinking about the strategies on how to manage them. Basically, what usually happens on projects that the stakeholders with low power, such as residents in this particular case, are neglected, and even more, it is not project managers don't think about enough on how to engage them. And one of the recommended strategies for those is keep them informed, which again leads us to another stakeholder that was neglected in this case, and this is media and the public. So what happens often is that when we don't engage the less powerful but impacted stakeholders enough, then they can become powerful by going through the media and to the public. So another tip for keeping all the stakeholders engaged, because it's not about identifying stakeholders, but to develop strategy on how to keep them engaged in the way we want them to be engaged, is to review the requirements regularly with them, because this is how we can also manage our risks and capture all the changing expectations and adapt communication strategies to avoid their dissatisfaction.
So the last tip here is that whoever comes into a project, whether it's the courier lorry driver who has to deliver something important for shipping or something like that, or it could be a regional manager, or it could be somebody senior position who joined yesterday, or whatever it is, you've got to be able to explain them what the project is. And a friend of mine, he says that people on projects, they're like railway wagons. They just sit there unless you pull them. And very often, unless people are absolutely clear what you want, they do nothing. So they're not, it's not they don't want to help, it's just they don't really understand. And so when we're putting our project across, they're not interested in that you're running a project that's worth 10 million and therefore you're a big project manager. What they're interested in is who is going to be impacted by this, which divisions, you know, is there a translation need? Is there a technical test need? Is there an authorization need? You know, who is going to be involved? How many people are involved? What countries are they in? What are the risks? I give you one I was involved in. We had people in Bratislava and in Barcelona, and there was no overlapping language. So you couldn't even explain to people what you wanted to do. And if you wanted something done and you didn't have the language, you had to phone somebody and say, I need this guy to do that. He sits near you. Would you please tell him? You know, so you need a very good way to do that is a single flip chart. And test that with somebody else, and they might think, you might think it's okay, and they might say, hey, I don't understand it. And today, of course, we all have a camera in our phone, so it's very, very easy to phone it and then pick it to telephone, send a picture, and then phone the other stakeholder, wherever they are, and say, look, I need to explain to you what the project is about. So that's that one. So we're beginning to run out of time a little bit there. Oh, and I think we're back to you at this stage.
Yeah, so please, if anyone has any questions, if they want to input them onto the chat function, we can call them out for the speakers. But to kick things off, I just have a question around the hierarchy of stakeholders. So, you know, you outlined quite a lengthy list, and it's what methodology do you felt have worked for you in terms of trying to work out that hierarchy of importance?
Well, what I find very useful is the power interest grid. There are a lot of tools out there that you can use in order to map the stakeholders and decide about who are the key stakeholders. Because when it comes to the requirements and the list of the requirements coming from the stakeholders, of course you cannot address all of them at the same time and with the same priority. So I think these matrices, especially the one I mentioned, the power interest grid is very useful to identify the key stakeholders, the ones that are powerful to impact the results of your project, the source of risks, and also the opportunities for you to be more successful on your project. But also the ones and also for each group of stakeholders, there are certain strategies that are recommended on how to deal with them initially.
Okay.
Can I add something to that, if I may?
Please.
Because there's another tool out there that they use to check who communicates with who. It's used on Twitter, for example, who's in touch with tens or hundreds of thousands of people. And in a company, you might find that, for example, that the manager in Singapore, just to give an example, somehow works in such a way that everything in Singapore goes through that person. And it may not show up, and it might, by the way, not be the manager. It might be it might be the office manager who's been there for 25 years and makes the coffee, you know. And if you don't identify that, you can't get messages around the system. So there are lots of tools out there, and we only wish we had more time to talk about them.
Well, actually, curiously enough, there's a question here by Andrew, which relates to that very topic. So hi, are there any, just from Andrew Killeen, are there any software applications for project management, task tracking, or team communication that you have opinions on, from Slack, MS Teams, MS Project? So perhaps some of the software applications that you found genuinely useful.
If I can come in on that one. In fact, my company started specifically looking at that sort of stuff before things like Twitter were invented. And I personally think that in a project, you need to know who is on your team, because otherwise you can't require them to come to a meeting, for example. You can't have gate crashes or people who don't bother to turn up and so forth. So I think that it's very important. You have to decide on which tool. You can't have different tools within a team, because then you get, it's obvious you lose time. And also, just to make sure you put up the photographs, I find that makes a huge difference when you have them. But Slack is okay. We use Slack actually, but there are other ones. But the key thing is decide which one and then stick with it. And there's a big company that I know in Zurich, and they just spent a lot of time picking up 4 or 5 apps and saying, look guys, these are the ones we use. So it's more a matter of making a decision than any particular. There's a lot of good ones. Zorana.
Again, I would say, I would just add to that, that I would be very careful with the tools, because tools are great. For example, Microsoft Project is a great scheduling tools, but we should be careful not to rely too much on the tools, because the tools can help you only in certain areas. For example, as you rightly said, for tracking the project dynamics and scheduling and so on. But it cannot help you so much with actually the soft skills in dealing with the stakeholders and developing strategies for communication in terms of other stuff. And I think we should be careful with that, not to rely on the tools that much.
But I would agree with that. And I would also say one of the best tools to answer the question is you ask people if they have any experience of the place you're talking about. For example, the first time I went to Finland, the guy that sent me was Finnish, and he said, by the way, in Finland, the men don't talk. Now, that may be a generalization, but it's nearly true. And what it means is that unless there are ladies in the group, you don't hear what's happening. They all just nod. And for Irish people, that's very off-putting. Owen.
Great. Okay, well, in the absence of any other questions, perhaps, Jason, if you want to give us just your last slide, just a summary of some of the top tips.
Well, I just go back to the tips there. So they're all there, but in principle, these slides will be made available to you. And if you wanted to follow up, our frustration is that we can't say everything we'd like to in half an hour. We'd love to say an awful lot more in this area. So
Exactly.
if it triggers something in your project environment, feel free to track us down. Thanks very much, Owen. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So rather than being in the way, the stampede between you and us and lunch, we might wrap up today. Jason and Zorana, thank you very much for the insights. The video and the slides will be uploaded to the ICBE website later today or tomorrow. And finally, thanks to all of you who attended today's webinar. And if you have any follow-up questions, if you could come back to Kate or one of the ICBE team members. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.